Come close, family. Let me ask you something. When was the last time African leaders truly looked each other in the eye, not just to shake hands for the cameras, but to speak from the soul? Not with rehearsed statements, not with diplomatic smiles, but with truth, raw, urgent, necessary? When was the last time the African Union didn't just meet, but actually listened? This week, in Ouagadougou, something rare happened. Quiet but powerful. It didn't trend. It didn't go viral. But if you listen closely, you'll hear it in the wind sweeping across the Sahel. Africa, for the first time in a long time, stopped talking long enough to listen. On June 17, 2025, inside a modest but guarded room in Burkina Faso's capital, something unexpected unfolded. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young, defiant leader of a battered nation, stood before the African Union's special envoy, Antonio Tete. What was meant to be a polite exchange turned into something else entirely. Traoré didn't give a briefing. He gave a warning. And when he said, "We are not in chaos. We are in awakening." If the African Union cannot tell the difference, then maybe the African Union is asleep. The silence that followed was louder than any applause. He stunned them. Not with anger. Not with accusation. With truth. The kind of truth that doesn't fit neatly in press releases. But before that day, before the gasps and the glances around the table, there was a longer road. A harder one. One paved with betrayal, blood, and something even more dangerous, hope. Let's go back. Let me show you how we got here. 2 years earlier, the name Ibrahim Traoré wasn't known across Africa. In Burkina Faso, some knew him only as the quiet soldier stationed near the north, in a land where the government rarely set foot. A land swallowed by fear, where armed groups crept through forests and villages vanished under the shadow of war. Traoré wasn't a man of many words. He was the kind who stayed after the dust settled, helped bury the dead, carried wounded children in his arms. He'd kneel beside mothers who had lost everything and ask, not what happened, but what they needed. He listened. He remembered. He saw too much. And slowly, something began to build in him. Not just anger at what the country had become, but a painful clarity about why. The government in the capital talked about development and international cooperation, but they didn't send water where people were thirsty. They didn't send help when schools were burned. They sent speeches. They sent silence. He wrote once in the margins of a pocket notebook, "This is not a war for territory. This is a war for memory. If we forget who we are, they win without firing a shot." Then came the collapse. Years of corruption, neglect, and rising violence brought the country to the edge. The people, tired of watching their children grow up with fear in their bones, rose. Soldiers followed. And out of the storm, not by ambition but by necessity, came Traoré. At just 34 years old, they handed him power. But he didn't come with fanfare. He didn't stand at a golden podium. He stood in the sun, dusty boots and a promise in his voice. This is not a seat of power. This is a front line. And I am not here to rule. I am here to fight for the people who never get invited to the table. But power, no matter how honest, comes at a price. Almost immediately, the African Union suspended Burkina Faso. The West labeled him another military ruler. It froze. Threats came quietly. Some from abroad, some from within. Ministers smiled in meetings and whispered in embassies at night. Traoré knew not all his enemies wore uniforms. Still he pressed forward. He toured the country. He sat on the ground with displaced families. He met with youth who had built schools from scrap wood and prayers. He didn't promise miracles. He asked questions. And listened. From that listening came action. Alongside Mali and Niger, he helped form a new pact, the Alliance of Sahel States. Not to provoke, but to protect. Not to reject Africa, but to remind it, we are still here. We still matter. And then, quietly but with purpose, Angola reached out. President João Lourenço, holding the rotating chair of the African Union, didn't send a warning. He sent a man. Antonio Tete. The mission was called listening, but everyone knew it was also a test. Would Burkina Faso soften its stance? Would Traoré blink? The meeting was set for June 17th. No cameras. No press. Just two men. Two chairs. One continent watching, whether it admitted it or not. At first, Tet offered kind words. Spoke of solidarity. Used soft language about challenges. But Traoré's eyes didn't soften. He waited. And when Tet finished, the room changed. Traoré stood. His voice wasn't loud. But it carried. This is not a moment for politeness. The Sahel is bleeding. And the rest of Africa cannot keep watching from behind tinted glass. He didn't accuse. He described. He spoke of children learning the sound of gunfire before they learned their alphabet. He spoke of promises made in Addis Ababa that never reached the people in Dori or Djibo. He spoke of betrayal, not from outsiders alone, but from the silence of brothers. And then came the line that made Antonio Tet shift in his seat. You say this is a listening mission. Then listen closely. Burkina Faso is not asking for rescue. We are demanding respect. And if the African Union cannot stand with those who bleed first, then what is it for? The room fell still. And just then, as if to echo the urgency, Traoré's aide entered the room, eyes dark with worry. He whispered into his ear. Another attack in the north. More lives hanging by threads. Traoré turned back to Tet, his face unreadable. So, while we speak here in comfort, the war continues. My question to you is simple. Will the African Union write reports, or will it finally stand with us? That was the moment. The line. The room didn't breathe. And from that point forward, the African Union would never see him the same way again. Word spread before the delegation even left the palace. Inside government halls across West Africa, diplomats and ministers were already whispering. Traoré didn't hold back. In Addis Ababa, the African Union's headquarters buzzed with quiet panic. He turned the meeting into a mirror. In the villages of the Sahel, where radios crackled with news passed mouth to mouth, the people said simply, "He spoke for us." But behind that powerful moment was a trail of struggle most had never seen. Captain Traoré hadn't grown up imagining a life in power. He came from humble ground, raised in the western city of Bobo-Dioulasso, where the rain always seemed to miss the fields when they needed it most. His mother was a nurse. His father, a schoolteacher turned farmer. They taught him three things: work with your hands, speak with your chest, and never lie to the people. As a boy, he used to listen to his father read speeches from Africa's past, Nkrumah, Sankara, Lumumba. He didn't always understand the words, but he remembered the tone: proud, wounded, daring. He carried those voices into the military, even when others forgot them. By the time he was deployed to the northern zones, Traoré had already seen too many lives cut short, not just by bullets, but by the invisible violence of neglect. He never forgot the day he arrived in Arbinda, where children hadn't seen a teacher in over a year. A village elder told him, "We don't fear the terrorists anymore. We fear being forgotten." That sentence followed him like a shadow. And when his own commanding officers began hoarding supplies, prioritizing reports over people, Traoré pushed back. Not loudly, but persistently. That earned him enemies. Not all wore beards or carried rifles. Some sat behind desks in the capital. After the old government fell, many expected chaos. But something strange happened. Order began to grow, not from fear, but from trust. In town after town, citizens who had given up on Ouagadougou began organizing again, sweeping roads, rebuilding clinics. Not because they were told to, but because they believed maybe, just maybe, this time it would matter. Still, the shadows didn't disappear. There were whispers in the night. The captain is too bold. He's upsetting the balance. He needs to be handled. Foreign embassies sent gentle warnings. Aid froze. Arms shipments vanished. And behind the scenes, members of his own council met with foreign envoys to discuss alternatives. Traoré knew. He saw the same faces in meetings, nodding along, then leaking plans to foreign journalists and intelligence agencies. It didn't surprise him. That's how power works when it's afraid of truth. But he refused to bend. Instead, he moved in silence. He strengthened ties with Mali and Niger, both led by transitional military governments facing similar suspensions. Together, they didn't just build a defense pact. They built something deeper, A shared declaration: we will not be punished for trying to survive on our own terms. And while critics in Europe and even within the AU dismissed the Sahel alliance as a club of coups, in truth, it was becoming a political nerve center for something older than any modern constitution: sovereignty. Meanwhile, the violence on the ground didn't stop. The terrorists didn't care about politics. They struck schools, water points, convoys. Each time, Traoré responded, not just with force, but with presence. He visited attack sites within hours, met with grieving families without cameras. He slept in the same dusty compounds as his soldiers. People noticed, and they began to believe again. When the African Union sent Tet, many thought it would be a formality, a polite nod to diplomacy before more sanctions. What they got instead was a man who refused to play the role they'd written for him. But that bold message, "We are not begging, we are awakening," came with a cost. The day after the meeting, foreign media ran headlines: Burkina Faso defies AU. Traoré's risky gamble. Rebel leader lectures African Union. But the truth, as always, lived far from those headlines. In the Sahel, that speech sparked something else. Young people painted murals of Traoré on school walls. A group of mothers in Kaya organized a march, not for peace, but for recognition. "We are not victims. We are fighters," one said through a cracked megaphone. Soldiers reported rising morale. Local leaders who once hesitated to work with the government now asked for meetings. And yet, not everyone was inspired. Late one night, Traoré received an encrypted message from a trusted contact in Bamako. "Be careful. Some within are speaking to Paris. There is movement." He didn't show it on his face, but he felt it in his spine. The betrayal wasn't new. It was just closer now. Still, he didn't flinch. That same week, he held a press conference, not from the palace, but from a community center in Djibo, surrounded by elders and orphans. "We are not perfect," he said, "but we are trying. And we will not go back to being governed from far away. Not by the West. Not even by those who claim to speak for Africa while ignoring its pain." He ended with a challenge. Let the African Union not punish those who stand up, but stand with them. Let Africa not silence the voice of the Sahel, but hear it and echo it. And with that, the speech that stunned a delegation became a signal, not just of resistance, but of a deeper truth, that Africa's new leaders would not apologize for surviving, and that perhaps, just perhaps, the continent was finally beginning to listen. A week after the meeting in Ouagadougou, the official statement from the African Union finally arrived. It was cautious, vague as always. Constructive engagement, continued dialogue, shared commitment to peace. But everyone who was in the room knew that wasn't what happened. What happened was Captain Ibrahim Traoré spoke, not just for Burkina Faso, but for every African nation that had been treated like a footnote in its own story. And whether the AU wanted to admit it or not, they had been shaken. But shaking an institution isn't the same as changing it. And in the days that followed, Traoré would learn just how deep resistance runs, not only from the outside, but from within. It started with a convoy ambushed near the eastern border. A deliberate hit. Not the usual tactics. The attackers knew the route, the timing, even the specific vehicle carrying humanitarian supplies. It smelled like betrayal. That same night, Traoré sat alone in his office. Rain tapped at the windows. The power flickered, common in Ouagadougou. He stared at a hand-drawn map of the country, circles marking hotspots, arrows marking movements. Then he picked up a red marker. He drew one more circle, right around the presidential palace. "The danger is not out there," he said quietly. "It's here." The next morning, he called an emergency meeting. No suits, no microphones. Just his core officers, youth leaders, and a handful of mayors from across the regions. They sat in a half-lit room, drinking strong tea and speaking freely. One woman from the Centre-Nord region stood and said, "Captain, if they fear your truth, they will try to erase you. That's how they've done it before." He nodded. But he wasn't afraid. That night, in a dusty studio operated by volunteers, Traoré recorded a message. No edits. No polish. Just his voice and a flag behind him. To all Africans, he began, what is happening in the Sahel is not an isolated crisis. It is the mirror of your future. If we fall, your walls will not protect you. If we rise, your borders will not limit you. He paused, breathing steady. Africa must choose now. Between silence or solidarity. Between watching or standing. Between being remembered as a continent of meetings or a continent of action. The video went live. And this time, it didn't just circulate in West Africa. It reached Nairobi, Johannesburg, Cairo, Dakar. Youth groups began hosting forums. Radio hosts called it the rebirth speech. A Pan-African poet in Accra turned it into a spoken-word anthem. Street artists in Kinshasa painted Traoré standing in a storm, holding a torn map of Africa with his fist over the Sahel. But with attention came escalation. A leaked document surfaced. High-ranking AU officials, pressured by foreign partners, discussed disciplinary options for Burkina Faso if it continued aligning with non-constitutional regimes. Translation: more isolation. Possibly even regional blockades. Traoré laughed when he saw it. Let them isolate us, he told his council. It will only prove what we've been saying all along. They fear an Africa that doesn't wait for permission. Then, quietly, he sent envoys, not to Europe, but to Sudan, to Guinea, to the Central African Republic. He told them, go. Listen. Don't offer deals. Offer ears. In one village in northern Mali, an elder wept when she heard the envoy speak of unity. We thought no one cared anymore, she whispered. We thought we were invisible. Bit by bit, the story changed. Burkina Faso wasn't being seen as a fragile military state anymore. It was being talked about as something else entirely. A frontline. A warning. A spark. The African Union was divided. Some leaders whispered in support of Traoré behind closed doors. Others, threatened by the growing popularity of his message, hardened their stance. But the people? The people were watching. And in the end, it wasn't a vote, or a headline, or a signature that shifted the tide. It was the sound of 1,000 voices in different languages, from different places, saying the same thing. He is not perfect, but he is ours. In the final week of July, the African Union made a quiet move. No fanfare. No cameras. But it mattered. They opened what they called a new Sahel dialogue track. It was the first time they had ever created an internal platform specifically for engagement with suspended member states, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. They didn't say Traoré caused it. They didn't have to. The truth was already walking through the streets. Because this wasn't just about a young president. It wasn't about one fiery speech. It was about a shift, a long overdue crack in the walls that had separated African countries from one another and from their people. And as the dry wind of the Sahel carried dust across the borders, it also carried something else. The message: Africa is finally listening. And maybe, just maybe, it's about to speak with one voice.